I think you can begin introductions now. I think everyone's logged in. We haven't had any new people in a little bit, so I think you can start.
Okay, yeah, take two. Welcome everyone to hashtag Girl Power Leading Ladies Who Inspire. We're welcomed by three authors today, and I have little introductions for each of them. So, Allie Carter is the author of many well-loved and best-selling books, including the Gallagher Girls series and the High Society series. Her books have been published in over 20 countries, and her most recent novel is Winterborn: Home for Mayhem and Mystery, the second novel in a middle grade mystery adventure duology. Namina Forna is an LA-based author who also works as a screenwriter. She's the author of the New York Times bestselling novel The Gilded Ones, an epic young adult fantasy. She's also one of the authors featured in U2. 25 Voices share their hashtag MeToo stories. Florence Gonsalves is the author of Love and Other Carnivorous Plants and Dear Universe, two hard-hitting young adult contemporary novels. She is also a poet and lives in Virginia. And they will be in discussion with our felicitator Joy. And if you have any questions as you're watching, feel free to put them in the chat.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely want you guys to interact. So any questions, please just pop them in the chat, and then we'll be pulling whatever ones are super interesting, or just to ask our panel. So I suppose we should start with the very first question, which is, what inspired you guys to write? What started this writing bug?
Wow, that's just really went for that one, huh? Just writing in general. I guess I started writing as a little kid in a journal. And I think that practice of just putting words to paper eventually got me comfortable with my voice and stuff, which kind of built confidence in eventually writing books.
For me, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So for me, I grew up in Sierra Leone, West Africa, sort of at the beginning of the decade-long civil war, and it was really unstable. And as a kid, what I would do, well, it was a couple of things. First, my dad and my grandmother would tell me all these stories to sort of distract me. And I became a very avid reader from early on, especially in fantasy, because that was my safe space during this time. And so I sort of always knew that I wanted to create stories for other kids who live in not so ideal circumstances. But I didn't really know really know sort of for certain until I was in my late teens that I wanted to become a writer. But the minute I did, I knew that this was why I wanted to do it, was I wanted to create those safe spaces too, just like the authors in my youth did for me.
For me, I was always kind of that flaky kid that was, off in her own universe and telling herself stories and talking to herself and having imaginary friends and all of that kind of stuff. But I didn't really know that that was a job until I was in middle school and I read The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. And I grew up on a small farm in Northeast Oklahoma. And that book, of course, was set in Tulsa, which was kind of the nearest big city to where I lived. And I distinctly remember this. I was, I don't know, like sixth grade, seventh grade, something like that. And I was walking through my house, and I could take you to the very spot in my house my parents' house where I was standing, where my dad said, she's from Tulsa, right? And I guess, seventh grade me was really sexist because it had never occurred to me that S.E. Hinton was a woman. And then I found out later that she had actually written it when she was 16. And so I thought, okay, well, this is what teenage girls from Oklahoma do, is we write books. And then Tom Cruise stars in the movie, and then Prophet. It seemed all very, very kind of obvious succession there laid out for me. And so from that point forward, I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write books because that's what teenage girls from Oklahoma can do. So that's where it started for me.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's like a different take on how to begin. I really love that. I mean, sticking with the panel theme, which is girl power, what's it like, writing these type of role models for young women, in these middle grade years, high school, leading up, it's can be difficult to find, in media and books of these women who are actually really empowered and people that we can look up to and relate to, and what's it like trying to find that dynamic of relatability as well as role model.
That's a solid question, and I'll take a whack at it. So my book, The Gilded Ones, centers. It's an African fantasy, young adult fantasy that centers on a world where a group of women are told they're demons because they're faster and stronger and they bleed gold. Then actual demons come and the humans are like, wait a minute, I think we need these girls to fight these monsters and hopefully they'll kill each other off. So they offer the girls a choice, fight or die. My main character, Deka, decides to fight and in doing so changes her world. I had to give you guys the pitch because for me, writing this book, I guess it was sort of catharsis in that, like, when I grew up both in Sierra Leone and in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I moved when I was 9, there was always sort of that thing of like, well, girls do this and boys do this and girls are lesser. And it was always funny to me that it was always pitched in really nice religious terms, like, oh, or just in nice terms, like girls are sugar and spice and everything sweet, therefore they must be sweet and all of these things. And I always, at the back of my mind, thought that was complete and utter BS. I was just like, this seems unfair. There's something wrong with this, but everybody's like okay with this. Everyone's like, oh yeah, this is how you should be. And I would think that there was a problem with me because I was like, oh, this is how I should be. And it was only when I went to college, I started taking women's studies classes that I realized, oh, this is a scam. Like, these are all systems that are designed and it's not based on some kind of stringent fact. It's just, oh, this is keeping you in your place. And because I had such upheaval growing up, like asking these questions and then feeling bad about myself, I wanted to write a book that sort of made it easier for girls to understand what it looks like in a patriarchal society. And as to my main character, Deka, I think that watching her go through sort of her journey of first believing everything that she's told to believe, because that's what we do as girls, and then starting to question, I think that that's very relatable, because I think that that's what most teen girls are doing, is asking all these questions about, what does it mean to be a girl? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be femme or female presenting? What does it mean to, exist in the body that I do? And that's sort of the questions that I examine in The Gilded Ones. And hopefully Dega is a role model at some points, because at other times not, but yeah.
I think for me, one of the things I really love that. And just to kind of piggyback onto it, one of my kind of, I guess, pet peeves is I get this question a lot, and I've been getting this question a lot for a long time. And a lot of times I get it, and people come up to me like, your girls are so strong. We love that your girls are so strong and they kick butt. And one of the things that started through the years to grate on me is that we really only have a tendency to praise women who are strong in traditionally masculine ways. And so it's like, we really want to heighten your characters. We want to make them bigger. We want to make them stronger. And what they really mean is we understand that you've written these girl characters. How can we make them more like men? And so, and that is the one of those things that just really kind of gets my hackles up, because I use examples all the time that, you've got Katniss out there with her bows and arrows, but you've also got lots of girls in lots of fiction, lots of movies, lots of TV, lots of books that are, and in real life, let's face it, in the last year, they're not, killing anybody with a bow and an arrow, but they are taking care of their own schoolwork, taking care of their little siblings, getting dinner on the table because their mom's working 2 jobs. That's strength right there. That is a strong female character. And I think that we do a lot in our society of undervaluing that. And so that is one of the things that I like to get on a soapbox and preach about every chance I get. So thanks, Rochester Teen Book Festival, for giving me this chance.
I love that you both framed girlhood with respect to how the mainstream society views girls. And I think that that's something that I was considering a lot. In Love and Other Carnivorous Plants, my main character is Dani, and she is struggling with an eating disorder, and she is experiencing a lot of grief midway through the story. And I've been told that she was not a likable character. And that's always really interesting for me to hear, because I very rarely hear about a male character being unlikable. And it's well, why, what is it? How does she not fit the mold of what you think a girl should be? Is it because she swears too much? Is it because she is sassy? Is it because she's honest if she's angry, or something that isn't ladylike or specifically allowed within the realms or the parameters of how nice girls should behave? Yeah, and then I also have a character, Cam, in Dear Universe, who's super angry, and I just remember getting angry and getting called crazy by boys, and just feeling there was no space where a girl can really express some anger. And yeah, so I guess the expression of emotions feels really important to me. And I think also allowing characters to be messy, so almost inspiring by not being inspiring, in that neither of my characters handle big life issues in a way that a therapist would be tell your friends, do that. But I think that's also important, that girls don't necessarily need to be exemplary all the time. They don't have to be, model citizens or anything like that. So yeah, I think just making space for imperfections and subpar behavior.
I love that you brought up emotions. And first thing, anyone who's watching this and if you have any questions, please send them in the chat, because that's what we're here for. We want to have conversations with you guys. We definitely want to ask the questions that you guys are thinking. So please send them in the either privately to our question moderator, or just in the everyone public chat, and we'll definitely ask those as well. Back to what Florence said about emotions is, we have the badass women who are fighting and who are, taking care of their family, and they have these high priorities. But then I also love that we have, women who are taking care of themselves, putting their mental health first, eating disorders and stuff like that, of just allowing themselves to feel what they're feeling and be vulnerable, even if it's just to themselves or, one close other person. I think that's really important for us to read, especially as women, being able to talk about how we feel, not just suppress it because we have to be strong, because we have to, be tough for this world, but, talking about how we feel it, and, if we're sad, if we're angry, it's really, really important to express that, and to have role models, and like I said, of role models, but not being role models. They're not set up to show us what to do, or here's a perfect woman of here's what you need to do, but also what were their mistakes? How can we learn from their mistakes? I think that's a really interesting take on that.
Because I really think the hardest sentence in the English language is probably "I need help." And I think it's one that we have sort of drilled into people, especially young people, that the goal is always doing it on your own and not needing anybody. And so I think that that's why, like, most of my books end up being sort of ensemble casts, and you've got the kind of assembling the crew montage and everything, because every character does have to reach that point where they're like, I can't do this by myself. And there are things that I am weak at, and that's okay, because I can go out and get help from people who are strong in those areas. And I think that's a good lesson for kids to understand, because there's no reason in this day and age not to seek help if that's what you need.
I think, to the point of emotions, one of the things that I've always found fascinating is that girls and boys are taught to express emotions differently. And rather, they're taught to express emotions through two different venues. So with boys, it's anger. Every emotion you feel that's not ideal, you channel it through anger. With girls, it's sadness. Every emotion you feel, you channel it through sadness, you know? And one of the things that I always try to examine in my books, or that I examine in the Gilded Ones, is the necessity of girls claiming their anger. I always say that the Gilded Ones is the book of my rage, not my heart, because everyone's like, oh, this is the book of my heart. And I'm like, no, this is the book that I wrote because I was so pissed off at all the things that I had been taught about what it meant to be a girl. And I really wanted to examine that in the book. So like, you see my main character go from being, this very timid person who only feels sadness to embracing her anger. And that's sort of like my hope, is that, like, I hope we embrace all the good emotions too. But for girls, I think it's like really important that we tap into our righteous rage, that everything is not, oh, I feel some type of way, I'm going to cry, although crying is very necessary. And like, I enjoy a good cry, like a good cathartic cry, but I think it's also, we need to be like, I'm pissed. This is not okay. This is not cool. And of course, let's handle our anger in like constructive ways, because it is a constructive emotion. It tells you when there's something wrong that you need to look at, but it is very important that we tap into it in the first place.
So I suppose my next question is, with these female characters you write, how much of yourselves do you put in there? Do you find yourself having like a really connection with them as they're similar to you, or do you like writing these characters who are so different than you, and that's what you like about them? Because there are two ways you can really go about that. Of they're either very much like you and they're like, oh, this was who I was when I was a teen, or here's somebody I wish had been my big sister when I was a teen, or something like that.
All my narrators, I realized, are just myself in various stages of life, which I didn't realize until my first book came out. Like, I was really thinking that I was like, yeah, there are like some strands from my life or whatever. But then I was like, once I had some space from it, I realized that no, this character just like reflects everything that I was feeling in a specific stage of my life. I'm always really impressed by people who can write like pure out of the blue fiction, because that just is so hard for me. I feel like I have to start with a baseline of something that I know super well. And again, I think that tends to come out in a narrator through like a voice driven story. But yeah, I would love to hear if other people are writing pure fiction, because that'd be amazing.
Well, I think that no matter what I try to do, I think a little of me always seeps in. Like, I think I could sit down to be like, I'm going to write a book about an alien with 7 heads, and that alien would end up having some kind of my quirks or something. And you know, I figured out several years ago that no matter what I do, I kind of always end up coming back to writing girls who grew up in sort of odd, non-traditional family businesses. And so I've got a girl whose parents were spies. I've got a girl whose parents were thieves. I've got a girl whose grandfather is an ambassador on Embassy Row. I've got a girl whose father was a Secret Service agent. And in Winterborn Home for Vengeance and Valor, I'm writing my first orphan. And so she doesn't know who her parents are. And yet she goes to live with a guy who it turns out is a vigilante. And so she kind of gets sucked into the vigilante business. And so that's one of the things that I sort of automatically am pulled back to time and time again. And then I realized, I had a friend who actually pointed out the other day, she's like, you do realize that you grew up on a family farm, right? So you like being involved in the family business is something that I have literally been doing from the cradle up. So I do think that there are just some things that are sort of baked into your, not necessarily your DNA, but hardwired into you in some way, that we do, just themes we kind of are constantly drawn to. And I don't know that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I do think it's a very common thing in writing.
I think for me, it's funny. My main character, I did not set out for my main character to be like me, but I think that because of sort of the world in which he grows up in, where everything is so extremely patriarchal, and you're sort of suppressed, she did end up having some traits like I do, and I think those traits are not necessarily because it's who I am; it's because of how I grew up. But I also find it interesting that I write characters that are who I want to be, or some expression of what I want to be. So one of my favorite characters in my book, her name is Belcalis, and she is an extremely angry person who will like point out she will point out like, this isn't cool at like 200 pieces. She'd be like, oh, I see that, that's not cool. We're going to talk about that right now. And that's somebody that I wanted to be like, because I wanted to be, because for so long when I was growing up, I learned to just, I see this doesn't seem cool, but everybody's okay with it. So, okay, I'm going to shut my mouth. But Belcalis is like, oh, this isn't cool. I'm going to shout it to the rooftops. And I'm like, oh, that's what I want to be. So I wrote a girl like her who like calls everybody out on like their things and is like, no, you can't be quiet because this means death for us. So stand up, fight, be out there. So yeah.
Here's a question we got received for Allie is, how did you brainstorm and approach Cammie's mental health in Out of Sight and Out of Time from the Gallagher Girls series?
Oh, wow. So that's a blast from the past. So Out of Sight, Out of Time is my book where it's a series, and in the book before, the heroine had run away. And I wanted to, I write spy books, and it is just a rite of passage if you write spy books that you eventually will have to write an amnesia book. And so Out of Sight, Out of Time is my amnesia book. So she wakes up in that book and she has no memory of what happened over her summer vacation. And I probably did not handle it right. Like, I probably should have sat down with a mental health professional and actually talked about, like, okay, talk me through, PTSD, and talk me through amnesia, and talk me through, some of these sort of real world implications. But at the time, I didn't know to do that, and I didn't think to do that. And so I just sort of put myself in those shoes of, if you lost a chunk of your life, and if you were trying to kind of claw back and figure out what happened to you, and if you could tell just by the scars on your body and things that something really bad happened to you, and then you do reach that point where you have to ask yourself, maybe I don't want to know what happened to me. And so really, I think that I approached it like I think most writers approach all writing, which is just empathy first, and putting yourself in a person's shoes and saying, okay, if this happened to me, what would that feel like? And so that was sort of step one in that. Plus, by that point, I had written many, many books in that character's point of view. And so I knew that girl pretty well. And so I was able to dig down and kind of go through that. And in my opinion, that's probably my favorite of the Gallagher books. I don't know if it is the best or not. I don't know if any of them are any good, frankly. That it was certainly a challenging book to write from a number of standpoints, but the emotional part of it was actually quite easy. And what was hard was I had to figure out what happened over Cammie's. I had to figure out like 3 different plots, basically, because I had to figure out the plot of what was happening in the book, then the plot of basically what happened to her off screen, and then the plot of what had happened to her father 10 years before. So it was a lot of figuring out. There were a lot of whiteboards involved, and a lot of calls to my friend Jennifer Lynn Barnes, and poor Jen, she probably was ready to strangle me by the time it was over, but luckily we got through it.
That book in particular, the cover, it's the old cover was the dark blue, and she has the red scarf.
Yeah.
And don't remember which book, like, number it is in the series, but I'm like, oh, that I saw the title, I recognized the cover mentally. But following just the Gallagher series, because that's the series I'm most familiar with out of the books when you guys, how do you, like, the relationship, how do you write a strong female character but still give them a love story or a love interest, and by still keeping them strong and independent, but then also balancing a vulnerability with you know, having a partner or meeting somebody and wanting, you know, to fall in love?
Ooh, I'll take this one first. So in my book, it's funny. My book is a book about trauma. It's, of course, it's about, you know, what happens when you grow up in a society the way the girls do. But it's also a book about love and the many iterations of love. Because oftentimes I find that in literature or in just media in general, whenever we have groups of girls, they're doing a lot of infighting, who is, like, you know, stealing whose boyfriend and all these things. And I think that for me, one of the things that I miss a lot is the romance of female friendships, because to me, friendships are and can be a romance. Because, you know, when you think about how you met your best friend, you always be like, oh, we met on this day, it was a sunny day in spring, and we saw each other from across the room and we connected, and you have that whole story. So for me, I have a romance, and I have a couple of romances in the Gilded Ones, but the primary romance in the Gilded Ones is the romance between my main character and her friends. Because in my book, we have a girl who hasn't really had friends because everything for her has been conditional. And then she meets a group of girls who are like her and who she can finally be herself with. And in doing so, she sort of goes on this journey of exploration and of becoming the person that she is meant to be through her friendship and through being vulnerable with other people who can understand her and who can have a space for her, even if they don't understand her, like open that space where she can be her full self. And that to me is a glorious romance. There is a boy, incidentally, because this is a book with a Black girl and I wanted her to have that romance, but the primary romance for me is the female friendships. It's that, finding your found family and being able to be vulnerable with them and being able to be like, oh, you feel this way, I feel this way too, oh my gosh, so that's the romance that I love the most in my book.
Those are great answers. We have another question, which is, looking back on your writing, do you have any regrets with certain choices you made your character choose? Or you think, oh, maybe I should, looking back at, just seeing how times are changing, I suppose. Do you ever look back and think that, oh, maybe I should have done this instead? Or are you still really happy with the final product that's out there?
That's a really tricky question. I guess I should preface this by saying I can't open any of my books once they've been written because I just can't do it. I have not gone back and reread anything. I don't know what I'm so afraid of. Like there's not, or like a typo, or like, am I just gonna, I don't know. I really don't know what it is, but I can't look back at it. In retrospect, I wrote Love and Other Carnivorous Plants when I was right out of college, and I was pretty angsty and like upset. And I really wanted to write a character that kind of had her middle finger up. And I think I did that. But I kind of wish that in the end, I had made her a little softer and given her maybe a little bit more empowerment around her sexuality and around her body. But again, that's something that I would do at 28, not at 22. So I don't know. I think with my second book, Cam, I wrote that one, I think 2 years ago, and I think I was able to be softer there. And I know soft is kind of, I don't know, like a floaty term to use, but I just mean like able to be vulnerable. And I think I couldn't do that as easily in my first book because I wasn't ready to be vulnerable. But once, like, I think as I've continued to write, it slowly gets easier to allow characters to have a happier type of ending. Yeah, I don't know. I love that question. Sometimes I think about writing like little chapters after the book. And I would be very curious, Ali and Namina, to see if you do that too. Like, I would love to return 5 years or 6 years later and be like, actually, let's give you this ending.
I actually got to do that. So yeah, so for when we did the 10th anniversary editions for the Gallagher Girls books, they did new covers and everything, and then I actually wrote new epilogues for all 6 books. And then at the end of the 6th book, it was kind of a big epilogue of 10 years later. And so you got to see everybody 10 years later. And it was so challenging because, like you, I don't read anything after it's published. Like, nope, not looking, not finding typos, not being like, oh my gosh, that's the most awkward sentence ever, not doing any of that. So I did have to go back and kind of scan the books, just kind of remind myself a little bit of what was in there. And the big thing for me with that at that time with those books was that I did not know where the plot was going. And so when I wrote book 1, I didn't know who the ultimate villain of the series would be and some of those types of things. So that was more from a like craft kind of structure standpoint. It was great to be able to go in and put an epilogue in, sort of foreshadowing some of these things that I now knew were going to be coming down the pike. So that was really fun. That I like, who was it? Was it Picasso or Rembrandt or somebody said, a painting's never finished, I just stop working on it. And that's how I feel about books a lot of the times. Like, I would, there isn't a single book that I've ever written that I wouldn't sit down every single day and change something. And sometimes it would be something big, sometimes it would be something tiny. But the key is that I will never ever be happy with anything I've ever done ever. And it's such a fun place to live. So it's but you do kind of have to wipe your hands with it. And you look at it and you're like, oh, I made a mistake that time, or I wouldn't do a character like that, or I would have a cast that looks different, or what have you. You change that next time, and you move forward and you learn from mistakes that you've made.
Loki, I was waiting for you to answer that question, Ali. I was like, what is she going to say? She's written so many books. And it's fascinating listening to the both of you, because like, I'm exactly the same. I don't want to go back and read the book. Like, I don't want to touch it. I don't read reviews. Like, I'm just like, no, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. But the funny thing is, The Gilded Ones is a trilogy. So that means that whatever ending I've had, I can now build on, So in a way, you get to sort of not fix, but like rewrite a little bit of like, oh, I didn't like this in this book, therefore in this book I go deeper and harder in here. So I guess in one way that's like a little bit of like structuring things or rewriting things, but in terms of going back, no, never. No, that's a horrifying thought. I would find every single mistake ever. And then I'd be like, Namina, how could you not see that? What was wrong with you? Like, are you blind? You know, you go through that whole thing, like where you just talk yourself. Yeah. So no.
I think I would actually go into stores and like correct typos in books. I think every signing I ever did, I'd be like, oh, 142, got to go fix that, you know? And so it would be a vicious cycle.
Yeah, I suppose that just parallels life. You know, we all make mistakes, and hindsight's 2020. We can look back and we're like, oh my gosh, why did I do that? Why did I make that decision? And you can't go back and change it. And that's where you move forward, you learn. Speaking with real life and mirroring, what women inspired you growing up? What book characters in particular were your girl power females that that just inspired you?
I'll go first. So the woman who inspired me growing up was my mom. And that was because my mom was an immigrant my mom came to the United States as an immigrant. She was a lawyer in Sierra Leone, had her own law firm, went back to law school, and worked as a waitress while I was growing up. So I'd literally watch this woman who was used to a life of privilege, like now sort of be a student and a server, and have to work like literally all day. And I watched this growing up, and I watched her like trying to do the bar, trying to get a job, but couldn't get a job because, she's an African immigrant with an accent and nobody would hire her. So she built her own law firm again. And for me, seeing her seeing her work that hard, and seeing this like her literally lift us out of poverty when we came to the United States made me realize that if she can do it, like I can do it, like if my mom can like grind that hard at that level for so long, I have no excuses. So she is literally, I will always say, my inspiration. But in terms of book inspirations, Ella, in Ella Enchanted, I always found her amazing because she was so subversive. Here is a person who has been gifted like obedience and like finds her way around that. That's amazing. Like forever and always, just an amazing character.
I was also super inspired by my mom. I come from a very long line of teachers. And so mom, grandma, like my grandmother taught in a one-room schoolhouse. And it's, and what growing up in a farming community, what you find out is that pretty much all women do all the traditionally female work. And then they also do all the traditionally male work as well, because that's just what happens, when you've got to get hay in, or when you've got to get a crop in or crop out, or what have you. Everybody does everything. And so I very much grew up doing it all and seeing it all done. And it was very inspiring. But I'm a little bit older than most of my colleagues, because I grew up in a time where YA fiction kind of wasn't it definitely wasn't what it is now. And so I like to say that, when I went from Berenstain Bears to Barbara Taylor Bradford as a reader, because the YA was it was Beverly Cleary and Nancy Drew and S.E. Hinton, and there just wasn't the YA boom like we have now, like we were blessed with now. And so I read a lot of Nancy Drew, and then kind of went straight into like Agatha Christie and adult romance and adult fiction in a lot of ways. And I really, really am glad that we now have this wonderful, vibrant, diverse, and thriving genre of books for kids and books for teenagers specifically, because that is something that I think that the world desperately needed, and the world's going to be way, way better off for it.
I know we're running out of time. So just quickly, I feel like I've spent the last 5 years undoing everything I learned from who I thought were my role models. So like I grew up on women's magazines and The Hills and Sex and the City. And while I do think that there are some benefits to Sex and the City and portraying women's sexuality, overall, not like ultimately a role model that I would like to give a teenager right now. So I think to answer that, I found a lot of strength in like really smart girl characters, but then who I was liking in books wasn't necessarily being reflected in like what I was consuming on a daily basis media wise. Like Hermione Granger was the epitome of that was who I could be. I had curly hair too. Like we were going to get through this together. But then also looking at like Carrie Bradshaw, for example, I don't even know if Sex and the City is still on or if that's something that teens know about. But it's just like this. How do I say this? It's just very different, a different set of values that were kind of like conflicting. And yeah, I would love to go back to my teen self and provide her with something besides like Glamour magazine. But you know, is what it is.
No, right, exactly. And I think that's one of the wonderful aspects of YA fiction is like we're making, we have the Hermione Granger type characters, but then we also have characters who are, exploring their sexuality, who are exploring these more adult themes, where they're not exactly, 12, 13 wizards, but they're rooted in the real world as well as we have the fantasy. And it's just such a broad genre where, you can really choose what you want to read and what kind of female character you're in the mood to relate to or to read about. And that's, one of the joys of this genre of YA fiction. So we have reached the end of this panel. It's been fantastic, talking with you guys and just to, get your take on some of these issues as well as, what has inspired you and just learning about your writing. I've had a great time. We've had some great questions, and I'm not sure how we end this. I don't know if we just all leave or what, but we did have.
Yes.